All right, let's dive right into this. We're breaking down 5 major allegations of inhumane acts against Xi Jinping's government and 5 against Vladimir Putin's. All the information here comes from publicly available international reports and human rights organizations. We're just laying out what's been documented.
So let's start with the 5 key allegations related to Xi Jinping's China as reported by various international groups.
First up, we have the mass detention and surveillance of Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region. This is an issue that's really captured global attention, and for good reason.
So when you dig into the source material from the UN and others, you see reports of just a massive deprivation of basic human rights. The government's official line is that this is all part of a counter-terrorism effort. But what's documented are things like forced restrictions on religion and culture, which has led some international bodies to go so far as to label these actions as potential crimes against humanity and even genocide. Okay, number 2 on the list. This one's about the treatment of what are called prisoners of conscience. Now, that's a term for people who aren't locked up for a typical crime, but because of their beliefs or their peaceful political work.
The huge international concern here really boils down to the lack of any fair legal process. You have international monitors documenting case after case of pro-democracy activists, human rights lawyers, and others just being held for incredibly long periods with no access to a real legal defense.
The third allegation, well, this one is one of the most disturbing. It revolves around some really grave ethical questions about China's organ transplant system.
And the key word here is really transparency. You see, the Chinese government said it stopped using organs from executed prisoners back in 2015. But as the source material points out, there's a real lack of independent verification. And that has just continued to fuel international suspicion and a ton of calls for a real, independent investigation.
Coming in at number 4 is the long-running and severe suppression of the Falun Gong spiritual group, and it's not just them, but also other organizations that the state decides are a political or religious threat.
This really highlights just how systematic the whole crackdown is. We're talking about a campaign that's been going on for decades, reportedly involving torture, illegal detention, and these forced correctional programs. It's all aimed at any group the party sees as a challenge to its power.
And finally, for this section, the 5th point against Xi's government is the reported use of secret detentions as a way to control public conversation and basically shut down any protest.
Think about what this does. This practice of enforced disappearances, where people are arrested in secret and their families are told nothing, it completely bypasses any legal process. It's a method that creates this powerful climate of fear, and it can stifle dissent before it even gets a chance to start.
Okay, so now let's switch gears. We're going to look at the 5 points concerning Vladimir Putin's Russia. You'll start to see where some of these allegations overlap and where they're pretty different.
First up, and this is probably the most prominent allegation right now, it relates directly to the actions of the Russian military during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that started in 2022.
According to international courts and independent observers who are right there on the ground, these aren't just isolated incidents. We're talking about documented patterns of behavior. The allegations, which have been widely condemned as war crimes, include everything from the deliberate targeting of civilians and forced deportations to the use of torture and sexual violence.
And that leads us straight into the second major point: direct legal action from the international community.
So, in March 2023, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which is the body that investigates individuals for things like war crimes, they took a huge step. They issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin himself. This warrant specifically cites his alleged personal responsibility for war crimes in Ukraine, which is a major legal finding from the international community.
The third point zooms in on what's happening inside Russia, specifically the escalating suppression of any domestic opposition, especially since the war began.
What you're seeing here is a really systematic effort to just stamp out any kind of internal opposition. New laws have basically made it a crime to criticize the war, and that's led to long prison sentences for journalists, activists, and even just regular citizens who speak their minds. Free speech and peaceful protest have been seriously squeezed.
The fourth point is about a kind of legal assault on the very idea of civil society. You know, the human rights groups and NGOs that are supposed to operate independently from the state.
Using laws about foreign agents and undesirable organizations, the authorities have just been systematically shutting down independent groups. This basically chokes off any independent monitoring, legal help, or social programs inside the country, silencing critical voices and tightening the state's grip.
And finally, the 5th point against Putin's government is the reported widespread use of torture and abuse against people in detention, both inside Russia and in the territories it occupies.
And these reports, including some from the UN, point to systematic abuse inside detention centers. The methods they describe are absolutely brutal, and the stories coming out of places like Chechnya and the occupied parts of Ukraine are particularly horrifying. It points to a really grave and ongoing human rights crisis.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, when we pull it all together and put it side by side. You can see these clear overlaps, right? Both are accused of political and speech suppression, targeting minorities, and dismantling civil society. But then you also see these really key differences, like the very specific international legal action against Putin for war crime. So, we've laid out the allegations as they've been reported by international sources. It's a pretty stark look at two different, but in some ways very similar concentrations of power. And it leaves us with one final big question to think about. When state power operates without any real transparent accountability, who is it that really pays the price?